Hello, my name is Ryan Grams. I'm with the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Today we are meeting with John Friedli. Hello, John, and why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? When were you born and where?
I was born on July 16th, 1954 in Monterrey, Nuevo Leon, Mexico. My father was the general manager of a U.S.-owned dairy business in Monterrey. And so my younger brother and I were born in Mexico. Family lived there till 1962. So for the first 8 years of my life, I lived in Monterrey. Went to the American school, which was a school that mainly the population of the school were Americans, diplomats. Lots of businesses were in Monterey, so it was K through 12. It seemed like a normal high school, except in every grade we had Spanish, so we were bilingual. And so in my 1962, the my dad's dairy business was bought up by a different owner, and I think eventually they federalized the business. And at that time, I had two older brothers that were getting ready for junior high and high school, and my parents felt, I think for education and for everything else, we'll move to the States. So we settled in San Antonio, Texas, and so that's where I spent the rest of my growing up years in San Antonio. It's interesting. My dad is a World War II veteran, and he didn't even know he had veteran benefits when we moved to San Antonio. It wasn't until he reconnected with other Americans in San Antonio they realized that he could get a military ID card, and he was medically retired from the Army, so full benefits. And so we grew up 15 minutes from Fort Sam Houston, and got very much acquainted with with military bases in the regard from Fort Sam Houston and the Army and the medical corps and stuff like that. So that's where I grew up, and graduated from high school, from Teddy Roosevelt High School. Played football in high school and track, and then I applied to different colleges in Texas. My two older brothers went to Texas A&M University, and I thought that'd be a good school for me, and so I went to A&M, and I joined the Corps of Cadets there. It's not just ROTC. The Cadet Corps at the time was probably about 2,500 students, and you could pursue a contract, with the Army or with the military and get a commission, or you could stay in the Corps of Cadets, because at that time I think it was one of the only recognized informal fraternities on campus. So I would say about maybe 20% of the cadets would get a commission in the military. And I wanted to do that. My dad served in World War II. I felt kind of a patriotic duty to at least serve. The other reason was I got a degree in recreation and development of natural resources. Yeah, College of Agriculture. And initially I wanted to be a park ranger or forest ranger. Started looking at the salaries for those positions and how hard it was to get started, and I was going to take a commission anyway, so it was a good way for me to start. So I got commissioned in May of 1976, the tail end of the Vietnam War. In fact, I didn't necessarily qualify for the GI Bill benefits, that Vietnam veterans did, but I remember, several of our ROTC cadre were riffed from the Army. They didn't offer them retirements. They got their early outs, and it was kind of sad to see that going on. But I was commissioned as a second lieutenant. My two older brothers went into the military as well. My oldest brother graduated from A&M and commissioned in the Air Force. My next older brother was commissioned in the Army. So I wanted to serve. Didn't necessarily want to make it a career. At that time, for me, it was 2 years of active and 4 years of reserve for a total of 6 years. So, I said, well, I'll do that. And I even knew at that time that young officers coming out of the military, maybe had 6 to 8 years, were pretty competitive in the business world, and I felt that was going to give me somewhat of an edge. So, got commissioned. I was selected for Ordnance Corps, which is, at that time, it was munitions and maintenance. I didn't go the maintenance route, I went the munitions route, and went to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland, for my officer basic course. And that's where I met my wife. She was a lieutenant permanent party at Aberdeen, and we met, kind of whirlwind romance. I mean, I was there from February of '77 through May, June. We met, and we felt very much connected. And I went off for the second phase of my officer basic course at Redstone Arsenal because I was in munitions. So I went down to Redstone Arsenal for the munitions track. She stayed at Aberdeen. She was, at the time, she was a first lieutenant military intelligence, but she was assigned to the school brigades. So she was executive officer of a battalion, and actually part of her duties were she ran 2 dining facilities. But anyway, so our plan was we got engaged, and we were going to get married in Germany. And I had already received an initial assignment to Germany, and she was trying to get reassigned to Germany. They weren't very cooperative with her because she'd only been there for about a year, and so the Army had a program. I think that, I don't know, back then it was pretty new. Joint domicile assignments. The Army would guarantee you 1 joint domicile assignment. So we decided, well, then we need to be married, and then they'll send you to Germany with me. So, one of the other things that happened, I remember when I was going through officer basic course at Aberdeen, I got my initial assignment, because initially I was going to be 2 years active, and it was to Fort Hood, Texas. And I said, that's about 3 hours from where I live. I said, that's the last place I want to go, is somewhere in Texas. So that's when I said, well, can I go to Germany? And they said, yes, but you'll have to extend your active duty for a 3rd year, because it's a 3-year assignment. So I said, sure, I'll do that. And then, of course, my wife and I got assigned to Germany together, and we were both stationed in Frankfurt, Germany. Because of the joint domicile provisions, we had to be assigned kind of together. So she went to the 205th MI detachment in Frankfurt. I went to the 3rd Support Command headquarters. I wouldn't call it the best assignment for a 2nd lieutenant. I was in a corps support staff as a 2nd lieutenant, and it was different. I learned quite a bit, but then she got reassigned to the 302nd ASA battalion there in 5th Corps headquarters. So we were in the Abrams building in Germany at the time, and a lot of, this during the Cold War, so everything was, all our efforts were on, the East-West German border and Fulda Gap and everything. So we did 3 years in Frankfurt, and my wife was coming up on 5 years of active duty, and so we had to decide, okay, what are we going to do when we get back to the States? Well, she was headed for the Officers Advanced Course at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I would have been headed to the Officers Advanced Course at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland. So we'll be apart for 6 months. And she said, well, she really wanted to get out. We were thinking of maybe starting a family, and she just thought, she knew how hard it was for 2 officers to be in the military with kids. We saw some of that in Germany, where husbands on deployment. I mean, not deployed, but in the field for 3 months. The wife's, who's an officer, is in the field for 2 months. What do you do with kids? It was a challenge. So she decided she was going to get out, and she had a degree in education. She wanted to teach. So get back to the States, and I applied I went to the Officers Advanced course. Now my active duty obligation just got added onto because I went to a military course. Now the Army said, well, then you'll have to do a utilization tour because we're sending you to school. So automatically for another 3-year assignment, which I thought, that's fine. But when I was going to the advanced course, looking for stateside assignments, and at the time, the golden triangle of the U.S. was Fort Ord, Fort Lewis, or Fort Carson. So talked to Milpercent and said, how do I get to Fort Carson? Is there a way for me to get to Fort Carson? And they said, well, there's a slot opening up about the time that you would be finishing the Officer Advanced course, but you have to apply for EOD school. It's an EOD assignment. It's commander of a EOD detachment. And at the time I thought, for promotion I needed to have a company level command, and I'd been in Germany, was in a staff position, never had any troops under me. So I said, okay, I'll go to EOD school. They give me a chance. Company level commands were in the Ordnance Corps, were in the United States, were pretty slim at the time. For a munitions officer, and this was one way to get it. So I applied for EOD school. Didn't know at the time, the washout rate was like, I don't know, 30-40%. But I mean, college grad, I should be able to get through it. But so after the advanced course, applied for EOD school, and at that time, my wife, she had already, gotten out of the military, so we were now at Redstone Arsenal, finishing the advanced course. Then we went to Indian Head, Maryland, the Naval EOD Technical Center in Indian Head, Maryland, for the first phase of EOD school, and spent 6 months there. Did okay. Kind of an interesting little tidbit of information. I'm a little green-red colorblind, and so I had to pass a color blindness test as part of my application because you read about red and green wires, and can you tell the difference? I passed the color blindness test, but it always was a little bit of a little anxiety when I actually got to school and had to actually put that to use. But I did all right. But at any rate, made it through EOD school. Got assigned to Fort Carson, Colorado. And I think that assignment for me was probably one of the most exciting and rewarding assignments. One, because all the enlisted members of that detachment had many years in bomb schools already. That was their career. For an officer, it's typically not a career path that you would spend the rest of your Army career in. There might be a few, but so I was very fortunate that my first sergeant was a Vietnam veteran. Had spent 2 tours in Vietnam, one as an infantry scout, the second one as a bomb tech. All the NCOs had at least 3 to 5 years of experience already. So I guess you might be similar to being a young officer and going to his first unit and letting the NCOs tell you what to do to a degree. I mean, I had some experience already, but taking, learning from them and learning how to lead and how to make judgments. But it was a fascinating assignment. Like I said, during that time, we had the Grenada conflict in Panama. Our detachment was on alert for those. We were a chemically augmented detachment, which meant our specialty were the chemical weapons, toxic chemical weapons. So that was our expertise, render safing those. But most detachments could do everything. So that was 3 years there. It was a fascinating assignment for a number of reasons. We were a tenant organization on Fort Carson. So we didn't, for chain of command, we didn't report to anyone on the base. Not to, at the time, Fourth ID was there. So we were attached to Fort Carson, but we were not reporting to anyone there. So we were kind of, had a pretty free range of what we needed to do. I mean, we did cooperate with them quite a bit, but where our compound was fenced in with with gates that required a code to get in. So as my first sergeant would say, the command sergeant major 4th ID can't get into our compound unless we invite him in. So we're never going to have a surprise inspection, put it that way. But our main mission was to provide EOD support for 4th Carson. They had a huge impact area, tank, artillery, mortars, all of that stuff. And then all EOD detachments, I think still, have a geographical area responsibility. We had Colorado and Wyoming. So any incident that happened in Colorado, Wyoming, military, civilian, we were there to help. Most police departments did not have bomb techs at the time, or sheriff's departments, so we were doing a lot of support for them in that time. And then the other part of EOD, and I think it's still the case, is we augmented the Secret Service for protection of President, Vice President, any designated VIPs that had State Department coverage. So former President Ford had a place at Vail, so anytime he went there, Secret Service would have to be there. We would have to go and do all the sweeps. Any elected official that would do something in Colorado, Wyoming, we had to provide Secret Service support for that. It was also during the, I want to say the, I can't remember which federal election it was while I was there, but we also had to provide Secret Service support for all presidential candidates that received Secret Service support. So anytime any one of them came through our area or were on missions, I mean, we had to support them. So I sent a team to help protect Jesse Jackson when he was candidate. Gary Hart. I can't remember other candidates that that we were sent during an election year. EOD detachments are very, very busy doing all that support for all the candidates. It's not something you don't really think about, but but that was pretty exciting. You had 3 years there. In the Army, after you are branch qualified, which equates to having completed the qualifications in your basic branch, unit level, company level assignments, you can apply for an additional specialty, and it could be a number of different alternate branches at the time. I chose procurement and acquisition, just because it kind of fit munitions management, where you could be a contracting officer working for the government, working as a contracting officer with contracts with defense contracts. So I applied for that. And that again was a 1-year assignment, but it also incurred another 3-year utilization tour. So what started out as 2 years active, 4 years reserve is now, you know, now I'm by the time I finish here, I'll be 9 years, you know, into the Army. I spent a year in Downey, California. The Army has this, Army and Air Force, and I think Navy had the same program. I spent a year with Aerojet Ordnance Company, who was a defense contractor that made, they actually manufactured bullets for the A-10 Warthog, the Gauweight 30 millimeter, and also the 25 millimeter rounds for the Bradley at the time. And they also manufactured some munitions for the military. So I spent a year in Downey, California, learning how they do business with the government, and then the following assignment would be working for the government, doing business with them. So it would make you a smarter contracting officer. You know, and one of the things that I learned from that was that, you know, government contractors aren't, their mission isn't to you know, rake all the money they can from the government. They want to make a decent profit and provide a good quality product to the government, because if they do, then they'll continue to get contracts, you know. So it was a good experience spending a year there. And when we got assigned to California, that was about the time that Debbie got pregnant with our first son, and we so that was an interesting time for us. I finished that 1-year assignment, and my next assignment was going to be at Rock Island, also Illinois, which is in the Quad Cities area. You know, Arsenal is actually on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. In between, when I got assigned to that post, the reporting time frame, it was like 45 days from the time I finished the California assignment before I had to report to Rock Island. That was the only time that we ever were able to take advantage of military hops. We flew Space A, and we flew Space Available on a C-141 to Australia. So quite an exciting trip. You know, like I don't know if anyone else has flown Space A. I don't know if it's still, back then it wasn't very automated, but you had to make sure that you better had enough money to get back, because there wasn't any guarantee that you were gonna, wherever you were headed anyway. So we flew a
It's the same now.
Yeah. So we flew a C-141, a cargo plane, sat on the nylon seats along the fuselage. I had to be in full Class A uniform while traveling. We could only carry one small bag with us. So we flew from Norton Air Force Base to Honolulu, spent 28 hours there, then took off again for Pango, American Samoa, which is a military base there, and then from there into RAF Sydney, Australia. It's a fascinating trip. We were able to get back on a military hop as well. We spent 3.5 weeks in Australia and befriended many people on that trip. But it was an exciting time. I've never had the opportunity to take it again as a family, but you know, maybe one of these days. But yep. So I spent 3 years at Rock Island Arsenal as a contracting officer, and I was promoted to captain while I was at Fort Carson. Now I'm coming up on getting close to major. And even though you're an ordnance officer, and I had this additional specialty, in order to stay competitive for promotion, I needed another ordnance assignment. And at that time, there were company level commands in Germany, but they were 04 commands, majors, in nuclear weapons. And way back when I was a second lieutenant, when I first went through Officer Basic, I actually went through a nuclear weapons familiarization course. So I kind of knew nuclear weapons. I was qualified in it. I spent 3 years in bombs disposal, and we had to learn how to render safe nuclear warheads. So I mean, I qualified for that. There was an assignment, a company level command in northern Germany, a nuclear weapons ordnance company, and the ordnance companies had the tactical warheads, and we had access to the nuclear codes. But in this case, we were a NATO support unit, so we supported the British Army of the Rhine in northern Germany, and so we had our company. We had all the nuclear weapons stored in these special exclusion areas up in northern Germany. But what was interesting about this assignment was I didn't have any equipment. I didn't. All the vehicles, all that support was British provided because we were British support. The only U.S. equipment we had were what we call the rat rigs, the mobile communication vans that we would communicate between firing units and with higher headquarters for nuclear codes. So fascinating assignment. I had like 150 soldiers in the unit, the typical ordnance company, except I didn't have a large motor pool that was my responsibility, just the communications equipment and generators, things of that nature. But I don't know how familiar you are with unit commands, but when you take over a company, you have to sign for everything. And I had to sign for all of the nuclear warheads. They were my responsibility, and if anything ever got lost or damaged, I'd be paying for it. And to this day, I can't remember how many we had, but it must have been in the millions of dollars that I signed for. But fortunately, I had some good warrant officers that could track all of that. That was a fascinating assignment. We had field artillery detachments that would be co-located with the British units that would be helping them to fire the rounds. We had Lance missile warheads, so there was Lance missiles that were fired, 155 millimeter and 8-inch nuclear warheads as well. Yeah, kind of interesting time frame. Of course, this was during the the Cold War, and the threat was across the Fulda Gap, and it was very interesting. What was also interesting about this assignment was learning how the British forces went to war, and I think the U.S. units could learn a lot from them. When we deployed to the field on maneuvers, our goal was to hide and not be discovered, because that would be fatal. The British never set up any tents. They would co-locate in farmers' barns. They were completely concealed. You wouldn't even know they were there. And we had the communication satellites that would be the ones that we would receive the nuclear codes to arm warheads and stuff. But going to field with them was unique. Even though we had Army generators that were supposed to power our communications rigs, the British would not let us use them because it would give our locations away. I remember going out in the field, and I was with a British officer, and we were trying to find this American unit. He says, "Just stop here, tune off the engines. They're over there." He could hear the generators running. So anyway, just fascinating how the British worked. It was a fascinating assignment. We were stationed with British officers on a British base, and lived in British quarters, and it was very, very fascinating. Um, about the time that I'm getting ready to relinquish command, that's when the wall went down, 1988, or I'm sorry, 1990, and the threat from the Soviet Union was no longer there, and that's when they decided to pull all of the nuclear weapons out of Germany. The officer that came in, took over command, deactivated the unit. So I was the last commander of that unit as a functioning unit. So gave up command. At that time, I'd been 2 years in Germany. The opportunity to do another assignment in Germany came up, again back in my additional specialty of acquisition and procurement. And it was down in USER headquarters. The USER headquarters Inspector General's office had a spot for an acquisition officer to run their contract inspection team. And so 2 years in northern Germany, because it was a separate assignment, the Army let us go back to the States for a month, paid for the flights, and then I got reassigned to Germany for another 2-year tour in Heidelberg. That was a fascinating assignment. Our team was responsible for inspecting all of the military, community, regional contracting offices. And I think back then there was probably, maybe 175,000 soldiers in Germany, in Italy, and then, actually in the UK, Denmark. I mean, they were everywhere, and every community had a contracting office that would buy things to support the community, mainly items that would support the community clubs, officers clubs, enlisted soldiers clubs, community clubs, and so we were responsible for inspecting those offices to make sure they were following all the Army regulations and DoD regulations. So I traveled to Italy and to UK and to Belgium, the Netherlands. Didn't make it to France, but so that was a fascinating assignment for us. And after 2 years there, back to the States, and another assignment in acquisition and procurement. At that time as well, there was a big drawdown in U.S. forces. Now that the threat from the Soviet Union was gone, and so the Army was overstrength in ordnance officers. I still had the acquisition and procurement alternate specialty, and so there were positions in the States. I chose, there were several, and there was a position here in Grand Rapids with the Defense Contract Management Office, and it was an office of about 150 government civilians, commanded by a full colonel, one Army major, one Air Force captain, and one Navy lieutenant, and the rest were government civilians, and all the military officers were in procurement and contracting. And so our function was to be the military leg of that organization. But when I got there, the position for commander was downgraded from a full colonel to a lieutenant colonel, and even the acquisition corps was doing a drawdown. So I spent 3 years here in Grand Rapids on active duty, and because of the drawdown, one of the reasons why I didn't get promoted, I didn't get picked up for lieutenant colonel. I applied, didn't make it the first go around. Typically, the second go around was going to be like a 3% chance of getting promoted, and at the time, with the drawdown, they were offering early retirement packages, full benefits, even if you didn't do a full 20 years. I had like 19 years and 6 months. I could have taken another assignment. I mean, I wasn't gonna force me to retire, but I knew my chance for promotion were pretty slim. My son Adam had started school, he was in the first grade. We thought, why pick up and move again? Let's just stay here. And so I decided to put in my papers for retirement. And I wasn't sure, we weren't sure if we were going to stay here or not. It was either going to be here or Colorado, because that's where the other place we liked. Started applying for jobs. Was having some success with interviews. Then about 2 weeks prior to retirement, I get a phone call from the director of sales at Johnson Technology in Muskegon. And our office had done audits out there at Johnson Technology because they were a government contractor. They manufactured components for jet engines, and they were doing an accounting audit, and the director of sales asked the team, "Hey, do you know of anyone who's getting out? We need a contracting officer. Anyone who's available?" And they said, "Yeah, Major Friedli is." And so he gave me a call. I went for an interview. Everything went well, and so 2 weeks after I retired, I started working for Johnson Technology. So it was the only little bit of a commute. We decided we weren't going to move, so we stayed in Ada, and I spent 22 years with them. 3 years after I started for them, they got bought up by GE Aviation, General Electric, became a wholly owned subsidiary. Spent 22 years there, and retired from there in 2018. So, interesting military career. Never got deployed, but I find that interesting that during that time, many soldiers, officers enlisted could spend 20, 25 years and really maybe get deployed once or twice, but now it's so different. You go on active duty, even Guard and Reserve, and you're going to see deployments to conflict areas. So it's quite different. So I consider myself fairly fortunate that didn't happen, but I would have been ready to go. So yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question. I want to go back just a little bit because there's some interesting stuff you've said in there, and I want to go back and ask some questions to that.
Yeah.
We were talking about, when we're in and doing change command, you got to lay out everything, so they sign for everything.
Mm-hmm.
So as you said, you had to sign for all the nuclear warheads. With that, did you actually have to see each one?
Yes.
Did you get to put your hand on a nuclear warhead?
Oh yes.
That's an interesting story. How'd that feel to be able to put your hand on a nuclear warhead? Because not many people in the world get to do that.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, is the artillery round. It looks like a regular artillery round. It's just nuclear enhanced.
Yeah.
It was interesting. In fact, many stories said, well, you don't ever want to sit on top of one of those because they're radiating some low level nuclear radiation. But yeah, I had to actually put my hands on everything, count them all, make sure that not only the warheads were there, but they all had limited life components that I had to also inventory and make sure everything was there. That was a fascinating experience, really. The exclusion area that we had was double fenced. The outer fence was patrolled by British soldiers, and the inner fence was patrolled by U.S. MPs. So I had an MP platoon assigned to my unit as well, and we had to be on call for any sort of incidents. I always found it fascinating that nuclear weapon storage areas had a lot of instruments and and anti-intrusion and anti-pilfering devices that would make it virtually impossible for anyone to steal one, get in and steal one. You know, the getting into one could be possible, but all the measures that were taken once they got in there would prevent them from leaving with anything. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. They had all kinds. They had. You go inside the bunker, and the ceiling is lined with a curtain of concertina wire. That anytime anyone attempted to open the bunker, that concertina wire would fall on top of all the warheads. Then I think the internal inside would fill with a foam that made it impossible to even. You would never get out. You could get in, but you would never get out. Yeah, put it that way.
Did you ever look at all those in front of you while you're doing it and just go? Was it ever like scary going, we know we have this at any moment? It was a feeling like like a heavy feeling knowing that it's there.
Tremendous responsibility.
Yeah.
I think artillery round had a 1.2 kiloton warhead. You know, the Lance missiles were much larger. You think about the the impact any of those would make, and and the fact that they've never been used. But that's right. Yeah. The other thing that was fascinating, anytime any of those weapons, warheads, there were a certain level of maintenance we could do at the unit level, but if there was some sort of general maintenance on the warheads, they had to be transported to another safe location, and that was always done by air, never by ground. So a Chinook would land in the exclusion area, pick up the warheads, take off, and we had to provide constant communications from the point they were picked up to the I think the general depot. It might have been down in southern Germany. So a chain of communications that would keep them in constant contact. I had to deploy the rat rigs all along the route. It's pretty different. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's great. And so, and going back to, let me go back a little bit further too, to let's talk about when you were in your EOD training through the school, and I'm going to go back further from there too, but talk about EOD training and think about what was your favorite part during your training to learn to do this stuff?
I think was the practical exercises, where you had to go out and they would set out the dummy rounds. You had to evaluate what you're going to do it correctly, and do it right the first time. Those practical exercises, actually we used small quantities of explosives. I think the most fascinating part of the training was how to respond to improvised explosive devices, because that's not your typical, it's a military round, we know what's in there, we know what kind of fuse it has, we know what to do with it. But it's the homemade bombs that were the ones that you had to really think about what you were going to do. We had instruments that it was like a fluoroscope that would, like a portable X-ray that would take an image of whatever's inside, and we could develop it right there and figure out what we had. I think the thing to always remember, we always had to remember, was on any sort of a improvised explosive device. This was before they had remote tracked vehicles that could do it. You approach it once. So you go down there with a fluoroscope. You set the explosives so that you don't have to go back again. Now, there were times where you had to go back again, and that's what the real crunch time was. And then the other part of the training that was pretty intense was responding to a toxic chemical round. because we had to be in full butyl rubber protective suits, and um, it's not like your regular mop gear. It was full butyl rubber, and on a normal day you had like maybe a 20 or 30-minute stay time in those before you would succumb to heat exhaustion. So yeah, so those were very intense, very kind of exciting in a way, but fortunately we never had a real incident like that, but yeah, those are probably the most exciting. And then obviously the nuclear weapon portion of EOD school. That was the only time I ever got to be right next close to an ICBM warhead, a multiple ICBM warhead, where the Minuteman threes that had like
the Minutemans,
yeah, they had like multiple warheads underneath that skin, and to see those weapons and to actually see a 10 megaton warhead, that were bombs at the time. This just it's awesome. Yeah, I mean just the destruction you could provide from those was quite different. Yeah. So, that was as part of the training. That was pretty exciting. The other part of EOD training was you had to study at night, and all your studying had to be done there because it was all the manuals were classified. So you couldn't take them home to study. You had to go to study hall there, and so you had to be disciplined. And I think for enlisted guys, it was really challenging. So some of us officers we'd kind of study together to help them because many of them maybe had not gone to college, so it's different. But yeah, that was a fascinating time there. Yeah.
Sounds just awe-inspiring.
Yeah, it was pretty exciting. I mean, again, of the exciting, rewarding, challenging assignments, it was the EOD detachment and then the nuclear weapons company. Yeah, that was quite different. Yeah.
Any other highlights or lowlights you'd like to talk about on here?
Well, I think the assignment, I guess the Fort Carson, the EOD assignment was another interesting assignment because of the coverage that we provided to local law enforcement. We actually supported the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms for a mission. They were raiding a compound in southern Colorado. Back then, there was a right-wing radical group called Posse Comitatus group, and they were ones that they thought the world's going to end and we got to defend ourselves. So we deployed on a CH-47 to this compound to retrieve hundreds of weapons, and the only reason we were there was because this landowner had 2.75-inch rockets that were military made, and he had a German World War II 20-millimeter cannon, and so we were deployed with them because of the military ordinance. The other interesting ordinance or mission that we had was we received a call from a local sheriff's department saying they had located what looked like it was a piece of military weapon, a component of it up around 12,000 feet up in the mountains. Some elk hunters found it. They read over the identification and numbers. We knew it was military. We called, it looked like it was a missile component. We called White Sands Missile Range, and they identified it as a component off a Pershing missile. And we're in Colorado, and we're going, yeah, what's that? I said, well, back in the early 60s, the air defense artillery schools, as part of graduation, would fire missiles, and they were actually training Germans, and they fired Pershing missiles from Fort what's the fort in El Paso? From the fort to White Sands Missile Range, and when we read the serial number off of this component, it was one of the warhead guidance systems. They said that was off a Pershing missile that was launched from the fort and to White Sands Missile Range. It went off course. They enacted the self-destruct mechanism and it failed, and the missile landed in Colorado. It was a dud missile, plain. But they said, we thought we retrieved everything, but this part of the guidance and control section, which was still classified, was sitting up here in the mountains. So we were deployed to go find that component, destroy any classified components. It also had explosive detonators in it, and so we were deployed to the southern part of Colorado. Local sheriff's department, we got into all-terrain vehicles, so this was way up in the mountains, and retrieve whatever components we could retrieve. We detonated the explosives. They flew in a Chinook to hoist the rest of the components off the mountain. We had to down several trees using explosives so they could have a landing. Oh, it's quite exciting. Yeah, that was pretty exciting. Yeah, and the last exciting part of that assignment was, as I was leaving command in 1984, an 18-wheeler carrying 4 Mark 84 Navy torpedoes overturned on the interstate up in Denver, where I-70 and I-25 intersect. And we were called to that incident. It received a lot of public media attention because of the warheads. The Mark 84 torpedo has a 500-pound warhead, so there's 4 500-pound warheads on this 18-wheeler. They set up an exclusion area that was half a mile in circumference on a Friday morning in the middle of rush hour, paralyzed the city. The mayor of Denver was very upset because of what was going on, and so it took several hours to clear that. The warheads were never arms, but the hazard was torpedoes carry this auto fuel, which is it's a fuel that's designed to run underwater, so it produces own oxygen, and if it came in contact with the leaking diesel fuel, that would create a highly explosive situation. It was, we ended up being on TV to interview the after-action report and why it took so long to render safe. Allegedly, the Army, the military got a kind of a black eye because of that. And they said, well, why was that truck on that interstate? Well, most people forget that the interstate system was built for military readiness. So so you're not gonna, anyway. So I often reflect on that. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. So those were kind of exciting times. Yeah.
Sound like you had a very interesting career.
Yes. Yeah. It was pretty amazing. Like I said, not necessarily filled with deployments. A different time altogether. A fascinating time for me. With my wife being in the military at the time. She was a direct commission before about the time they were authorizing women to the academies and ROTC, but she was a direct commission right out of college, which was quite different. When she had to go, she never went through ROTC or anything, but she went through basic training as a WAC, Women's Army Corps. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah.
So, if you could go back and do it all over again, would you do it exactly the same?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, Yeah, you think about what could I have done anything different that would have kept me competitive for most of the lieutenant colonel? Well, maybe, maybe not. I mean, I wouldn't change anything. Uh, the assignment with the nuclear weapons company, I was the one ordnance company in a field artillery battalion. So the ordnance company were kind of the redheaded stepchild, if you will. You know, we were not field artillery, and so any things that were going wrong were blamed on the ordnance company. You know, I kind of dealt with that. The first battalion commander was not what I would call the best person to have as a raider, which made the first year very, very challenging. But his replacement came in and was a much better leader and respected the ordnance company much better. Yeah, it was quite unique. Yeah, very unique. Just a little, you know, I'd love to go back there. We have some friends we met, Germans, in Munster that we still correspond with, and they keep wanting us to go back there and see what it looks like now. You know, yeah, I'm sure it's quite different. Yeah,
Huh.
yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing everything. We
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Well, it was fun to do this. I'm a little bit anxious to see what it looks like after all of this, but it was great to be able to do this.
Well, thank you very much.